Hello, 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 hello. How long can I hold this note? I love being a contralto. Hello, my beautiful babes and babettes. I was getting sick of my intro and thought I would try something new. I won't be doing that every day. I just wanted to be particularly annoying today because that's funner. All right, so to be sincere, however, I would like to begin today to talk about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. If you are not familiar with this lovely document, go read it for yourself, please and thank you. I will be addressing 5 of the calls to action in the TRC every day, so 5 of 94 per video. We're going to be here for a while if you do the math on that, and it's going to be fun because I love learning new things. And already for this first video, I had to do some research, and that was nice. So, as I said in yesterday's introductory video, sorry, not sorry, I have a visual impairment, so I'm going to be reading these things off screen, which means I'm going to be in a very up-close and personal relationship with said screen. If you're bothered by this, again, sorry, not sorry. Nothing I can do about it. So, need to go down here. Need to maximize the lovely document given to me by the lovely Jeremy Dutcher. Thank you, sir. Thank you, thank you, thank you. You're wonderful. And we shall begin reading now. All right, so the first 5 calls to action fall under the category of child welfare. So very nice that they're organized into a little subsection of their own. All right, call to action number 1. We call upon the federal, provincial, territorial, and Aboriginal governments to commit to reducing the number of Aboriginal children in care by 1. Monitoring and assessing neglect investigations. 2. Providing adequate resources to enable Aboriginal communities and child welfare organizations to keep Aboriginal families together where it is safe to do so, and to keep children in culturally appropriate environments, regardless of where they reside. 3. Ensuring that social workers and others who conduct child welfare investigations are properly educated and trained about the history and impacts of residential schools. 4. Ensuring that social workers and others who conduct child welfare investigations are properly educated and trained about the potential for Aboriginal communities and families to provide more appropriate solutions to family healing. 5. Requiring that all child welfare decision makers consider the impact of the residential school experience on children and their caregivers. All right, so minimize this. Minimize, I say. Thank you. All right, so that's just the first call, and I want to get into more detail about this. In Canada, there is a disproportionate number of Aboriginal, as the TRC uses, I'm going to use that term, of Aboriginal children in foster care and who have been put up for adoption and who have been taken from their parents and or from their communities, maybe against their will. So I want to address the whole idea of they need to be taken away from this setting because their parents are neglectful. I think that while functionally in some cases maybe that might be true, what we really, really need to consider is the impact that the residential school system has had on Aboriginal families throughout the generations. As I have addressed in previous videos, the last residential school in Canada was closed in 1997. Willing to bet that quite a number of people in my audience were alive in 1997. I certainly was. I remember being 7 years old. And I personally think that that is an absolute disgrace to our country. But more than that, the children who were put into residential schools usually, if not often, suffered neglect, abuse, mistreatment, malnourishment. You name it, they probably suffered it, okay? And when they therefore return to their communities as adults, those impacts of the residential schools are going to stay with them. There are people currently alive, of course, who went through this system and who are now parents, who are now grandparents, and who are now, by the way, the children of people who attended these places, who were, forced to stay in these places. And I cannot emphasize enough the impact on a family that neglect and abuse, even against one generation, if not more, and there would be more than one generation of families in these places, the impact that that can have. Your own parenting style is going to be influenced by what you experienced as a child. This is true across the board. I don't care who you are. I don't care what race you are. I don't care what culture you belong to. This is true across the board. Garbage in, garbage out, unfortunately. People may not have the coping mechanisms, not only just to take care of themselves, but to take care of children. This is true, as I say, of any family, of any race, where neglect or abuse were factors in the child being raised to the age of being able to have children of their own. It can take upwards of 7 generations in a family to break this cycle of neglect and abuse. We, as settlers on this land, need to recognize the importance of attempting to keep families together when and wherever possible. And the thing that we need to provide more than money is strategies by which to help people heal and also to allow them to regain their own culture in order to heal in their own way. I personally believe that we need to take a step back and say we are not the superior factor here. Obviously, we have done so much harm than good, so much more harm than good on these lands and to these peoples. And I think that in a lot of cases, what we need to do really is step back and to look at things objectively rather than moving in and saying, this child isn't safe here according to our judgment, so we're going to put them somewhere where you no longer have access to your child, which only creates more trauma, both for the parents and for the child and for the extended family. So, if I may say my little piece on that. And by the way, please, if anyone in my audience is Indigenous and therefore probably better informed about any of this and all of this, more so than I am, please get in touch with me. I need some advisors from within the communities themselves. And I'm not ashamed to ask for help because I'm not ashamed to say that there are spots where I will be ignorant. I am doing my research. I do have somewhat of a background in knowing about some of these things, but it's not going to be widespread enough. It's not going to be cohesive enough for me to give the full picture or for me to have all the knowledge needed to make this series in full. So please, if anyone is willing to help me out, help me out. That would be great. All right, I am moving on to the call to action number 2. Maximize. Thank you all. All right. Number 2. We call upon the federal government in collaboration with the provinces and territories to prepare and publish annual reports on the number of Aboriginal children, including First Nations, Inuit, and Métis, who are in care compared with non-Aboriginal children, as well as the reasons for apprehension, the total spending on preventative and care services by child welfare agencies, and the effectiveness of various interventions. So this, to me, speaks to the fact that the Canadian government at its different levels. So in Canada, for any Americans out there watching this, we have, just like you have, federal, provincial, and municipal levels of government, but the Aboriginal nations also have their own forms of government because they are sort of considered nations within nations. And a lot of the time, by the way, our provincial would be equal to your state. A lot of the time, the three different levels of government don't communicate well even within themselves, but also between themselves, let alone communicate very well with the Aboriginal governments. So the whole point of this one is that people be aware of the information that is out there so that situations that may negatively impact various families and communities can be changed. It's very important to have statistics on these things. As I said at the very top of this, there are a disproportionate number of Aboriginal children in foster homes and in group homes as compared to non-Aboriginal children. So, white, Asian, Black children living in Canada. And that is fundamentally, at least in my view, fundamentally due to the residential school system that impacted these communities so vastly and so negatively over the course, by the way, of several hundred years. As I say, the last one in Canada closed in 1997. And if the cycle of generational neglect and abuse, the cycle of generational trauma, lasts for 7 generations, a generation is roughly 30 years. Do the math. That's how long this could last. And it could last even longer because of the systemic racism faced by Aboriginal peoples and communities. So we need to do better as a society. We need to do better as a nation. We need to learn how to communicate with our brothers and sisters and everyone in between living on Turtle Island with us. And I think that we are capable of doing this, but we have to keep open minds, please. And we have to educate ourselves about the atrocities of the past. This is why I am doing this. I want to educate myself too. So this is why I am doing this. And this is why I am also asking for advisors from the communities themselves. That would be wonderfully appreciated. All right, moving on, going to maximize. Boop. All right, number 3, call to action number 3. We call upon all levels of government to fully implement Jordan's principle. All right. Federal, provincial, municipal, okay? In Canada, we have subsidized healthcare. We have socialist healthcare, as Americans would call it. I had to research this morning. Jordan's principle refers to the death of a boy named Jordan River Anderson, who lived in Winnipeg, Manitoba. So the province just west of Ontario. If you look at a map, Ontario is pretty darn big, okay? It's hard to miss. It's bigger than Texas. But just to the west of us is Manitoba. And what happened with Jordan River Anderson, he was an Indigenous boy with a life-threatening medical condition, and he died in hospital waiting for treatment, despite the fact that treatment was available, because the federal, provincial, municipal, and Aboriginal governments could not agree between themselves who was responsible for this boy's care. Jordan's principle, therefore, was created, but still has not yet been fully implemented. I will have a video, by the way, about the calls to action that have been implemented versus haven't. Jordan's principle, however, states that care comes first, payment comes later. So if an Aboriginal citizen is brought into a hospital with such a life-threatening condition or any condition, treatment comes first, and then the different levels of government can squabble between themselves about who's responsible for paying these medical bills. As I say, in Canada, we have socialized, subsidized healthcare. The government pays for it through our taxes rather than us paying for it as individuals. And I know that to some of our southern neighbors, this can seem like a communist system. I think it works a little bit better than things do in America, but when it comes to Aboriginal youths and Aboriginal elders and, people who have to be brought into hospital for medical care, and people can't decide on, who is actually responsible for paying for this between the different levels of government. I think that that gets a little bit too messed up, to the extent that the person themselves is not being considered in the matter, only who pays for that person's care. So Jordan's principle states care comes first, payment comes later. Care is the more important thing. And this also concurs with the Hippocratic Oath to do no harm and to cause no harm. So I think that that's a really important one to implement, and we're still not there, unfortunately. I believe Jordan River Anderson was hospitalized and died in 2006. So it's been a while, okay? Bear this in mind, by the way, that, like I say, not all of these, in fact, most of these, have not been implemented as of now. Maximize. Whoop. Cool. All right, call to action number 4. We call upon the federal government to enact Aboriginal child welfare legislation that establishes national standards for Aboriginal child apprehension and custody cases, and includes principles that 1. Affirm the right of Aboriginal governments to establish and maintain their own child welfare agencies. 2. Require all child welfare agencies and courts to take the residential school legacy into account in their decision making. 3. Establish as an important priority a requirement that placements of Aboriginal children into temporary and permanent care be culturally appropriate. All right, so this accords with the first call to action rather well, because basically it is saying that other levels of Canadian government should, in appropriate cases, back off and allow the Aboriginal governments, which are independent within their own nations, to care for the child who has to be put into foster care. And this is also a case of making the setting, as the call to action says, culturally appropriate. What we do not want to do is to assimilate that child into, the culture of the colonists, which is exactly what the residential schools attempted to do, and which is now thankfully considered more or less a form of abuse, especially when it comes to children. And that doesn't necessarily mean that in their foster homes these children are going to be abused, but to be separated from one's culture of origin is considered in these cases a form of abuse, because that was part of the systemic wrong done by the residential schools in the past. So we now, thankfully, are realizing that that is a form of cultural abuse, abuse from one culture to another. And we don't want to do that anymore to as great an extent as we are capable of not doing that. I don't know whether this one has been implemented. The last video in this series is going to be about the calls to action that have been implemented versus the ones that haven't. So I'm going to be doing that research towards the end of this series. As far as I'm aware, however, as of today, 2021, only 6 of the 94 calls to action in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission have been fully implemented on all levels of government in Canada. That's bad. So we need to keep going, and I need to keep reading. Maximize. Cool. All right, number 5, last one for the day. We call upon the federal, provincial, territorial, and Aboriginal governments to develop culturally appropriate parenting programs for Aboriginal families. Okay. This one also seems to imply to me a step back for the mainstream levels of government, and to say The Aboriginal communities themselves have the right to cultural sovereignty. They should be the ones to decide how their own children are raised and in what cultural context. This is, I believe, a very important measure in that we are giving the people their rightful control back over their own culture, over their own history, over the legacy that they wish to create for the current generation and for future generations of children coming into these communities, being born into these communities, and being born into a cultural ethos of abuse, racism, systemic oppression. And we, through the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, are attempting to undo the wrongs that have been done over the course of centuries. In order to do so, however, as I keep saying, we need to take a step back and say the responsibility lays with you in terms of creating your culture anew, in terms of bringing back that which was valuable from the original culture before it was perverted by European influence. And in order to do that, though, we also need to give up our own control and say, it's their culture, they're better at it than we are. So we are not the ones in charge of this. We are only the ones in charge of stepping back and saying that we do not have the right to say how these children should be raised. That is not our job. Our only job is to prevent further abuses from occurring. And I think that that is probably the goal being expressed here in the fifth call to action, that we need to step back and say, we're not in charge. We want you to be in charge. And it's not so much a case of giving freedom, because that which can be given can be just as easily taken away. It's a step towards saying, we took your freedom, and we need to not neglect the fact that we did so, and we need to be the ones to step back and give back what we have stolen. So that basically is the process of giving back sovereignty, of giving back freedom, of giving back control over culture, control over the narrative that is being told and the histories that are being made, as well as the histories and cultures and languages and peoples that are being revived through this Aboriginal resurgence. And I hope and pray, I don't pray because I don't believe in that kind of God, but I hope and pray that this can be a successful endeavor at some point in my lifetime. Would be great. I don't know whether I can expect that. I'm 30 years old as it stands. Oh boy, getting on middle age. Fun. But I intend to work towards that end. So for anyone watching this who thinks that this is important, and you should think that this is important, I'm going to tell you that yes, this is important. Please step back and please educate yourself in terms of not only what has been done in the past, but also in terms of what you can do to make the future a better and brighter place. Because that is where we belong. That is what we are entitled to. That is what we should all have together. Because we are all siblings living on the same planet, the same continent, the same plane of existence, as the New Agers would say, you know. But those are the first 5 calls to action in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada. And I hope that this has been informative. And I also sincerely hope that I can light fires under some bums, because that is my goal with doing this series, and that is why it is meaningful, and I love it. I also love that I get to educate myself on this, because this is going to be both fun and disturbing, and I'm looking forward to both of those. All right, so I will talk to y'all tomorrow about the next 5, so 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, calls to action in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Read it for yourself and educate yourselves in the history, because it's interesting stuff, and I think it's important that we all know it. So I'll see y'all tomorrow. Bye! Mwah.